Picture two clocks running at the same time on opposite sides of the planet 66 million years ago. One clock is counting down in India, where a plume of molten rock rising from deep within the Earth's mantle has already begun forcing its way through the crust, building toward eruptions that will eventually bury an area 3 times the size of France under lava, in places more than 2 kilometers thick. That clock has been running for longer than anyone initially realized, and its final, most violent phase is already well underway. The other clock is counting down 93 million miles away, where a 6-mile-wide fragment of ancient rock, drifting for billions of years through the outer solar system, has finally been nudged onto a collision course with Earth. Neither clock knows about the other. Neither process caused the other to begin. And yet, according to the most precise radiometric dating techniques currently available to geologists, both clocks appear to reach their most catastrophic moments within a window of perhaps 50,000 years of each other, an interval that sounds enormous on a human timescale, but that, set against the roughly 1 million year span of the Deccan Trap's eruptions, is close enough to essentially count as simultaneous. This is the part of the extinction story that rarely makes it into the popular version. Not one clock, 2. For more than 40 years, this story has been told the same way. A single rock, 6 miles wide, falling from the sky on a single Tuesday 66 million years ago, striking the shallow waters of the Yucatan Peninsula and ending the age of dinosaurs in one violent afternoon. It is a clean story. It has a single villain, a single moment, a single crater as its final piece of evidence. And for decades, it has been treated in popular science as essentially settled, the last word on one of the most consequential events in the history of life on this planet. It is also, according to a growing and increasingly precise body of geological evidence, not the whole story. Because 66 million years ago, at almost exactly the same moment the asteroid struck, on the opposite side of the planet, something else was already tearing the Earth open from within. Not a single eruption, but a nearly continuous, nearly 1 million year outpouring of lava so vast it once covered an area 3 times the size of France, releasing enough sulfur, carbon dioxide, and climate-altering gas into the atmosphere to destabilize the planet's climate on its own. 2 catastrophes, nearly simultaneous, both capable, according to different lines of scientific modeling, of independently driving a mass extinction. And scientists are still working out, with increasing but not yet complete precision, exactly how they fit together, and exactly how much each one contributed to the ending of 150 million years of dinosaur dominance. This is not a story about replacing one villain with another. It is a story about what happens when a planet is struck twice, from 2 completely different directions, within a window of time too short for the fossil record to fully separate. To understand why this debate exists at all, you first need to understand what each side of the argument is actually built on, because both sides rest on real, physical, dated evidence, not speculation. The asteroid impact hypothesis begins with a thin, dark line of clay found in rock layers all over the world, discovered in the late 1970s by the physicist Luis Alvarez and his son, the geologist Walter Alvarez, while examining limestone sequences near Gubbio, Italy. Walter Alvarez had been studying that boundary clay for years, trying to work out how much time it represented, when his father, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist with no formal background in geology, suggested measuring the concentration of iridium within it, reasoning that a steady, known rate of interplanetary dust falling onto Earth's surface over time could function as a kind of geological clock. What the analysis revealed instead was not a slow, steady accumulation, but a sudden, enormous spike. Iridium at concentrations dozens of times higher than anything found in the surrounding rock, a signature almost never seen in the Earth's own crust, but common in asteroids and comets. That single anomalous measurement, published in 1980, is what first proposed the idea of a catastrophic extraterrestrial impact as the cause of the KPG extinction, more than a decade before anyone had located the crater responsible for it. The layer contains anomalously high concentrations of iridium, an element common in asteroids and comets, but exceedingly rare in the Earth's crust, and it appears at the exact geological boundary marking the end of the Cretaceous period and the beginning of the Paleogene, a boundary scientists refer to simply as the KPG boundary. The discovery of that iridium spike, present on every continent, in marine sediment, and in terrestrial rock alike, was the first hard evidence that something from outer space had struck the Earth in massive violence at precisely the moment the dinosaurs disappeared from the fossil record. 12 years later, in 1990, geologists confirmed the source. A buried impact crater beneath the limestone of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, roughly 180 kilometers across and nearly 20 kilometers deep, dated to the exact same moment as the iridium layer above it. The crater is called Chicxulub, and its discovery transformed the Alvarez hypothesis from an intriguing anomaly into what most scientists now regard as the central, unavoidable fact of the KPG extinction. In 2024, a large interdisciplinary team of 41 scientists from 12 countries prepared a comprehensive review specifically defending the primacy of a single Chicxulub impact against competing volcanic and multiple impact theories, underscoring both how strong the impact evidence remains and how actively contested the full explanation still is. The volcanic hypothesis, the other half of this story, is not a fringe theory invented to compete with the asteroid. It predates the discovery of Chicxulub itself, and it is anchored in one of the largest volcanic provinces ever identified on Earth, a formation in western India known as the Deccan Traps. Long before geologists knew an impact crater even existed, they knew the Deccan Traps were enormous, an outpouring of basalt lava covering more than 500,000 square kilometers, in places more than 2 kilometers thick, formed by a nearly continuous sequence of eruptions that overlap almost exactly with the end of the Cretaceous period. For decades, the central question blocking a clear answer was timing. Millions of years of uncertainty in the dating of volcanic rock made it impossible to say with confidence whether the Deccan eruptions happened well before the extinction, well after it, or in the same narrow window as the asteroid impact itself. That uncertainty began collapsing in the 2010s as geochronologists applied increasingly precise radiometric dating techniques to zircon crystals and volcanic ash layers within the Deccan Formation. A landmark 2014 study from Princeton University, using uranium lead dating on zircon samples pulled from 9 of the largest and most complete Deccan lava sequences, found that the most intense phase of eruption began roughly 250,000 years before the extinction event and continued for the following 750,000 years, releasing more than 1 million cubic kilometers of lava, and that 80 to 90% of the entire Deccan Traps eruptive volume occurred within less than a million years, tightly clustered around the KPG boundary rather than spread evenly across millions of years as earlier, cruder dating methods had suggested. That single refinement changed the entire shape of the debate. A volcanic event spread evenly across several million years would have given ecosystems time to adapt, buffering its climate effects the way slow, gradual change generally does. A volcanic event concentrated within a few 100,000 years, releasing the bulk of its gas and lava in repeated, closely spaced pulses, is a different kind of threat entirely. One capable of driving rapid whiplashing shifts in global temperature and ocean chemistry on a timescale, ecosystems have far less ability to absorb. Researchers using the same uranium lead zircon dating technique subsequently identified 4 distinct high-volume eruptive pulses within the Deccan Trap sequence, each lasting roughly 100,000 years and releasing enormous quantities of magma and greenhouse gas, with the first of these major pulses beginning tens of thousands of years before the Chicxulub impact itself. A separate team, working with argon-argon dating on volcanic ash, reached a different conclusion about the sequence, arguing that the steadiest, highest volume eruption of flood basalts occurred mostly after the impact, rather than before it. Two independently rigorous dating methods, applied to the same volcanic province, disagree on the precise ordering of events, which tells you something important about the current state of this research. Scientists are no longer arguing about whether the Deccan traps erupted at the same time as the extinction. The physical dating confirms that beyond reasonable doubt. What remains genuinely unresolved is the exact sequence, whether the volcanism was already weakening the biosphere before the asteroid struck, whether the impact itself triggered a surge in eruption intensity, or both. That second possibility, that the asteroid and the volcanism were not simply coincidental but causally connected, is one of the more remarkable findings to emerge from this research in the past decade, and it comes from an unexpected place, the ocean floor. A team led by researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, examined the timing and intensity of volcanic activity along the vast network of mid-ocean ridges that circle the globe, the boundaries where tectonic plates pull apart and new ocean floor is continuously formed by rising magma. Their analysis found that around the time of the Chicxulub impact, an estimated 96,000 to 960,000 cubic kilometers of magma erupted from these ridges worldwide, a volume on par with the largest eruptive events in the planet's 4.5 billion year history, comparable in scale to the Deccan traps themselves. Their proposed mechanism is direct. The impact at Chicxulub generated a shock wave and seismic energy powerful enough to travel through the solid body of the Earth and disturb magma chambers at plate boundaries on the opposite side of the planet, triggering an increase in the rate of seafloor volcanic activity that was already ongoing. If this interpretation holds, and researchers are careful to describe it as a compelling hypothesis rather than settled fact, then the asteroid did not simply strike a planet that happened to be volcanically active at the same moment. It may have reached into the Earth's own volcanic systems and accelerated them, turning one catastrophe into an amplifier for a second, geographically unrelated one. It helps, at this point, to understand exactly what each catastrophe was physically capable of doing to a global ecosystem, because the two mechanisms are not interchangeable, and their differences are central to why this debate has proven so difficult to resolve. The asteroid impact produced its damage almost entirely within the first hours, days, and years after the strike. On contact, it vaporized an estimated 100 billion tons or more of sulfur-rich rock at the impact site, injecting that sulfur directly into the upper atmosphere, where it combined with water vapor to form a global veil of sulfuric acid aerosols. Because that veil sat high in the stratosphere, reflecting incoming sunlight before it could reach the surface, its effects arrived almost immediately and hit hardest in the first 1 to 2 decades after impact, a sudden, sharp episode of global cooling and collapsed photosynthesis that climate scientists refer to as an impact winter. The Deccan traps operated on an entirely different mechanism and an entirely different timescale. Volcanic eruptions release both sulfur dioxide, which cools the planet in the short term the same way the impact's sulfur did, and carbon dioxide, which warms the planet over the much longer term by trapping heat in the atmosphere. Because the Deccan eruptions occurred in repeated pulses across 250,000 years, rather than in a single instant, their net effect on global climate was less a single sharp shock, and more a series of destabilizing swings, brief pulses of volcanic cooling from each individual eruption layered on top of a slower, cumulative background of warming and ocean acidification, driven by the steadily rising concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and dissolved in the oceans. A sudden, sharp, unbuffered instant of ecological shock on one hand, a slower, repeated, cumulative erosion of climate stability on the other. Both are capable of driving extinction. They simply do it on different clocks, which is part of why disentangling their respective fingerprints in a single, geologically compressed rock layer has proven so difficult. With both mechanisms confirmed as physically real and closely timed, the scientific argument shifted from whether each event happened to how much killing power each one actually possessed on its own. And this is where computational climate and ecological modeling has become the primary battleground. A 2020 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences combined detailed climate modeling with ecological simulations of dinosaur habitat suitability, testing what would happen to dinosaur populations under an impact winter scenario driven by Chicxulub alone, and separately under several different modeled scenarios of Deccan volcanism. The result was unambiguous within the study's own framework. The impact winter scenario produced a severe near-total collapse in viable dinosaur habitat consistent with the fossil record. None of the tested volcanic scenarios came close to reproducing that level of collapse on their own. More strikingly, the same study found that the prolonged eruption of the Deccan traps may actually have acted as a partial buffer against the asteroid's effects in the years before impact, releasing enough long-term warming gas to offset some of the intense global cooling the impact winter would otherwise have caused, meaning that in this particular model, volcanism did not amplify the disaster, but very slightly softened it, right up until the moment the asteroid struck and overwhelmed every buffer the planet had. Other research groups, working with different assumptions and different modeling techniques, have reached strikingly different conclusions. In January 2025, researchers at Dartmouth College took an unusual approach specifically designed to remove human assumptions from the analysis. Rather than building a model based on a scientist's prior expectation of which mechanism should dominate, they constructed a system powered by roughly 130 interconnected computational processors and tasked it with reverse engineering the KPG extinction from the fossil and geochemical record itself, without any built-in bias toward either the impact or the volcanism as the primary driver. The model's output supported a scenario in which the asteroid impact contributed meaningfully to the extinction, but concluded that the release of climate-altering gases from the nearly million-year eruption sequence of the Deccan traps would, on its own, have been sufficient to trigger a global extinction event and clear the way for the rise of mammals, independent of whether the asteroid had struck at all. This is one of the most direct scientific challenges yet to the idea that Chicxulub alone was necessary and sufficient to end the age of dinosaurs, and it comes not from a fringe research group, but from a peer-reviewed computational study explicitly designed to be free of the confirmation bias that has shaped much of this field for 40 years. Underlying both sides of this modeling disagreement is a growing body of direct geochemical evidence that the Deccan traps were affecting the global environment well before the moment of impact, evidence that does not depend on any model at all. Researchers examining biogenic carbonate fossils, the mineralized shells and skeletal material of marine mollusks, recovered from a wide geographic spread of late Cretaceous sites, measured both ancient ocean temperatures using clumped isotope paleothermometry and mercury concentrations preserved within the fossil material itself. Mercury is a well-established geochemical tracer of large-scale volcanic activity, released into the atmosphere during major eruptions and subsequently deposited into ocean sediment and living tissue. The study found simultaneous, globally distributed increases in both coastal marine temperature and mercury concentration in the period leading up to the KPG boundary, a pattern the researchers attribute directly to volcanic carbon dioxide and mercury emissions from the Deccan eruptions, evidence of a planet already undergoing measurable climate stress and ocean warming before the asteroid ever entered the atmosphere. This does not tell us that volcanism alone killed the dinosaurs. It tells us, with a level of physical evidence independent of any climate model, that the biosphere absorbing the asteroid's impact was not a stable, undisturbed one. it was already a planet under mounting pressure. That pre-existing pressure may also help explain a pattern that has puzzled paleontologists for decades: the highly selective nature of the KPG extinction itself. The event did not simply kill the largest or the most visible animals at random. It eliminated all non-avian dinosaurs, all pterosaurs, the giant marine reptiles known as mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, and the free-swimming shelled cephalopods called ammonites, while allowing crocodilians, turtles, many small mammals, and one specific surviving lineage of dinosaurs, the birds, to pass through relatively intact. Researchers studying this selectivity have long noted that many of the groups that vanished were disproportionately large-bodied, slow to reproduce, and dependent on stable food chains stretching from photosynthesis at the base upward, exactly the kind of biological profile most vulnerable to a sudden collapse in sunlight and primary productivity of the sort an impact winter would cause. Groups that survived tended to share traits like smaller body size, the ability to shelter underground or underwater, flexible or scavenging diets, and in the case of some surviving bird lineages, the ability to subsist for extended periods on hardy, long-lasting seeds rather than fresh vegetation. This pattern of selective survival is more consistent with a sudden, sharp ecological shock of the kind the asteroid impact would have produced than with the slower, more gradual pressure typically associated with volcanic climate change, and it forms one of the strongest pieces of evidence supporting Chicxulub as the immediate, final trigger of the extinction, even among researchers who accept that Deccan volcanism had already been destabilizing the broader ecosystem for tens of thousands of years beforehand. The most precise dating work yet published on the relative timing between the two events comes from a team using argon-argon radiometric dating specifically calibrated against the Chicxulub impact layer itself. Their results placed the best estimate for the age of the impact at 66, 0.52 million years ago, a date that fell within roughly 50,000 years of what the same research identified as the peak eruption period of the Deccan Traps, a gap so narrow, on a geological timescale spanning tens of millions of years of Deccan activity, that the researchers described the impact and the volcanic ramp-up as essentially simultaneous events. 50,000 years sounds like an immense span of time on a human scale, but set against the roughly 1 million year duration of the main Deccan eruptive phase, it represents a vanishingly narrow coincidence, the kind of overlap that becomes very difficult to dismiss as random chance once the dating precision is fine enough to detect it. This is the central, uncomfortable fact sitting at the heart of this entire scientific debate. Two of the largest, most violent geological events of the last 100 million years, one from outer space and one from deep within the Earth's mantle, converged within an extraordinarily narrow window of geological time, on the same planet, affecting the same global ecosystem. And 40 years after the iridium layer was first discovered, researchers still cannot fully separate which fingerprints in the fossil record belong to which catastrophe. What the fossil record itself shows, independent of both the impact and volcanic modeling, adds another layer of complexity rather than resolving it. Terrestrial KPG boundary sites, harder to find and interpret than marine sediment, because land-based rock is less consistently preserved over tens of millions of years, have historically been underrepresented in this research, and the imbalance matters more than it might first appear. Marine sediments accumulate in a relatively continuous, predictable way on the ocean floor, undisturbed by erosion, weather, or the kind of geological reworking that constantly reshapes land surfaces, which is why the overwhelming majority of the world's best preserved KPG boundary sections and the overwhelming majority of the paleoclimate data used to build both the impact and volcanic timelines come from marine rock rather than terrestrial rock. A 2024 study examining a terrestrial boundary site in the Sichuan Basin of China, roughly 15,500 kilometers from the Chicxulub crater, and around 5,600 kilometers from the Deccan Traps at the time of the extinction, was specifically designed to close that gap, comparing signatures of both the impact and the volcanism at a location distant from either source. Findings from terrestrial sites like this one matter enormously because the extinction did not affect only marine plankton and shelled organisms, the groups most commonly used to build the climate record. It eliminated non-avian dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and a range of terrestrial reptiles whose fossil evidence exists almost exclusively in land-based rock, meaning any complete understanding of what actually killed the dinosaurs specifically, as opposed to marine life broadly, has to be built from exactly this kind of harder-to-find terrestrial evidence, and that evidence base is still, by the admission of researchers actively working on it, significantly incomplete. Every terrestrial site added to the global record, whether in China in North America's well-studied Hell Creek Formation or in more recently excavated sequences in India itself, close to the Deccan source, adds another independent data point that either strengthens or complicates the picture. Built almost entirely from ocean sediment over the preceding 4 decades, there is also a question that predates both the impact and the volcanism entirely, and it deserves to be addressed honestly rather than folded quietly into either side of the debate. Were dinosaurs already declining before either catastrophe struck? This is one of the most persistently debated sub-questions in KPG research, separate from the impact versus volcanism argument, but frequently entangled with it. Some paleontological analyses of dinosaur diversity in the final few million years of the Cretaceous have suggested a possible decline in the number of distinct dinosaur species already underway before the boundary, potentially driven by long-term climate cooling, changing sea levels, or shifting plant communities that dinosaur herbivores depended on. Global sea levels are known to have been falling gradually through the final stage of the Cretaceous, a process that would have reduced the total area of shallow coastal habitat available to many dinosaur communities and altered the boundary between marine and terrestrial ecosystems across large parts of the world. An independent, non-catastrophic pressure operating on a time scale of millions of years, well before either the Deccan eruptions intensified or the asteroid arrived. Other researchers, working with different statistical methods and different fossil data sets, argue that the apparent decline is largely an artifact of incomplete and geographically uneven fossil preservation in the final Cretaceous, noting that the best sampled dinosaur-bearing rock formations from this period are concentrated in a handful of regions, primarily Western North America, and that apparent global diversity trends drawn from such a geographically narrow sample can be misleading. These researchers argue that the fossil record, properly corrected for sampling bias, demonstrates dinosaurs remaining globally successful and widespread right up until the boundary itself, with no genuine biological decline preceding either catastrophe. This particular disagreement remains unresolved, and it matters because it changes the starting conditions for the entire extinction event. A planet already experiencing a genuine, biologically real decline in dinosaur diversity would have been more vulnerable to either the impact or the volcanism finishing the job. A planet with dinosaurs still thriving right up to the boundary implies both catastrophes, or their combination, did essentially all of the killing themselves, with no pre-existing weakness to build on. The disagreement over dinosaur decline connects to a broader pattern researchers have identified in the oceans, one that offers a third, independent line of evidence sitting alongside the terrestrial fossil record and the direct geochemical mercury data. Studies of foraminifera, the microscopic, calcium-shelled organisms that form the base of much of the marine food web and that fossilize in extraordinary abundance in ocean sediment, show a documented decline in diversity and abundance beginning before the KPG boundary itself, a pattern some researchers link to the earliest, most intense pulses of Deccan volcanism and the associated warming and acidification of ocean surface waters. Because calcium carbonate shells dissolve more readily in acidic water, and because volcanic carbon dioxide entering the ocean lowers its pH over time, a pre-boundary decline in shelled marine organisms is exactly the kind of signature volcanic-driven ocean acidification would be expected to leave behind, distinct from the far more abrupt, catastrophic collapse in marine productivity that followed the asteroid impact itself, when sunlight was blocked so severely that photosynthetic plankton, the very base of the ocean food chain, nearly stopped functioning across the entire planet for a period of years. Two separate acidification and productivity signals, one gradual and pre-boundary, one sudden and post-impact, layered on top of each other in the same rock record, is precisely the kind of evidence pattern that makes disentangling the two catastrophes so difficult using any single method in isolation, and precisely why the current generation of researchers increasingly argue that the only way forward is combining multiple, independent lines of evidence, geochemical, climatic, and paleontological, rather than relying on any one data set to settle the question alone. The recovery period following the extinction offers one further, often overlooked piece of this puzzle. Ecosystems did not simply reset themselves cleanly once both catastrophes had run their course. The fossil and pollen record shows that in many regions, particularly across the Americas closest to the impact site, plant communities were dominated for an unusually long period by ferns, hardy, spore-producing plants capable of recolonizing scorched and light-starved landscapes faster than flowering plants or trees, a pattern paleobotanists call the fern spike, and one of the clearest signatures anywhere in the geological record of a landscape recovering from sudden, severe environmental shock rather than slow, gradual change. The duration and geographic extent of that fern-dominated recovery period varies meaningfully depending on distance from the Chicxulub crater, with sites closer to the impact showing a more severe and prolonged disruption than sites farther away. A spatial pattern that is difficult to explain through volcanism alone, since Deccan-driven climate stress, being globally distributed through the atmosphere rather than radiating outward from a single point on the map, would be expected to leave a more geographically uniform signature. This geographic gradient in the severity of ecological collapse, worse near Mexico, less severe at greater distances, is one of the pieces of evidence most frequently cited by researchers who continue to regard the Chicxulub impact as the primary and most immediate trigger of the extinction, even while accepting that the Deccan traps had already been eroding the resilience of global ecosystems in the hundreds of thousands of years leading up to it. Taken together, what the current, most rigorously dated evidence actually supports is neither the clean, single villain story most popular science still tells, nor a simple 50-50 split between two independent causes. It supports something closer to a compounding cascade. A planet already under measurable climate stress from nearly 250,000 years of intensifying volcanic activity in the Deccan traps, its oceans already warming, its mercury and carbon cycles already disturbed by repeated large volume eruptions, was then struck within a window of geological time too narrow to fully resolve, even with today's best dating techniques, by a 6-mile wide asteroid delivering, in a matter of hours, a level of instantaneous climate shock that dwarfed anything the volcanism alone had produced across 250,000 years. That impact may then have reached back into the Earth's own volcanic systems, accelerating seafloor eruptions along mid-ocean ridges worldwide, and quite possibly intensifying the very Deccan eruptions that had already been weakening the biosphere for tens of thousands of years before the impact occurred. Two catastrophes, arriving from opposite directions, converging on the same narrow window of time, each one capable in isolation, according to different research groups working with different but equally rigorous methods, of driving a mass extinction on its own. The debate that remains is not whether both were real. The physical evidence for both, the iridium layer and buried crater on one side, the mercury spikes, ocean warming signature and precisely dated eruptive pulses on the other, is no longer seriously disputed by anyone working in this field. What remains genuinely open, and what continues to drive new research using increasingly precise radiometric and geochemical techniques, is the proportional weight each catastrophe carried, and whether asking which one killed the dinosaurs is, at this point, even the right question to be asking about an extinction built from two disasters that arrived by any reasonable geological measure at almost exactly the same moment. There is a broader implication buried inside this specific scientific disagreement, one that extends well beyond the story of the dinosaurs themselves. For most of the 20th century, extinction science tended to search for single, identifiable causes, a single asteroid, a single ice age, a single disease, because single causes are easier to test, easier to model, and easier to communicate. The KPG extinction, the best studied and most precisely dated mass extinction in the planet's entire 4.5 billion year history, is increasingly serving as the clearest demonstration that this search for a single cause may itself be the wrong framework, at least for events of this scale. Every one of the 5 recognized mass extinctions in Earth's history that predates this one shows some evidence of multiple overlapping stresses rather than one isolated trigger. Large igneous province volcanism paired with ocean anoxia, sea level change paired with rapid warming, and so on. And the KPG extinction, precisely because it is the youngest and therefore the best preserved of the 5, is now providing researchers with an unusually detailed, high-resolution case study of exactly how two independent global catastrophes can compound each other's effects, weakening the same biosphere from two different directions within a geological instant too narrow to fully separate. If confirmed, the Berkeley team's proposed link between the Chicxulub impact and accelerated volcanic activity at the mid-ocean ridges would represent something rarer still. Direct evidence that a single asteroid strike is physically capable of reaching into the Earth's own internal volcanic systems and amplifying them, a mechanism that, if it holds up under further scrutiny, would mean the asteroid did not simply arrive alongside the Deccan volcanism by cosmic coincidence, but may have actively intensified it, turning what began as two separate disasters into something closer to a single, interconnected chain reaction, spanning from the outer solar system to the base of the Earth's mantle. None of this diminishes the significance of Chicxulub itself, and no serious researcher working on this question today argues that the asteroid was a minor factor in the extinction. The iridium layer, the crater, the shocked quartz grains found at impact proximal sites, the geographic gradient in ecological severity radiating outward from the Yucatan, and the sudden, selective pattern of survival among species best equipped to endure a sharp, short-lived collapse in sunlight, all point overwhelmingly toward the impact as the immediate, final trigger that tipped an already stressed biosphere into full collapse. What has changed, and what continues to change with each new study, is the understanding of what that biosphere looked like in the hundreds of thousands of years before the asteroid struck. A planet already measurably warmer, already more acidic in its oceans, already carrying the geochemical fingerprint of volcanic mercury in its shells, and already, according to some but not all researchers, showing early signs of ecological strain among its dominant terrestrial animals. The asteroid did not strike a healthy, stable world and shatter it without warning. It struck a world already absorbing one of the largest volcanic outpourings in its history, and whatever the precise mathematical split between the two, that context is now understood to be part of the story, not a footnote to it. The version most people know, a single afternoon, a single rock, a single flash of light over the Yucatan, is not wrong so much as it is incomplete. A simplification that has persisted for 4 decades, in part because it is genuinely more dramatic and more legible than the far messier reality underneath it. A single clean cause fits neatly into a documentary running time. a planet destabilized by two independent, near-simultaneous catastrophes, their evidence tangled together in the same thin layer of boundary clay, does not resolve so easily. And that is precisely why the scientific literature on this question has grown rather than settled in the years since the Chicxulub crater was first confirmed in 1990. Each new dating technique applied to the Deccan zircons, each new mercury measurement pulled from a fossil mollusk shell, each new terrestrial boundary site excavated in a previously unsampled part of the world, adds precision without necessarily adding consensus, because the two catastrophes really did arrive close enough together that even a 50,000-year gap, precise by the standards of any other era in Earth's history, is barely wide enough to separate their effects using the tools currently available. The full picture, the one currently being assembled zircon by zircon, mercury spike by mercury spike, isotope ratio by isotope ratio, is a planet that was struck twice within the same narrow geological instant, once from a source 93 million miles away, and once from a source buried within its own mantle, and an ecosystem that has spent 150 million years dominating every continent on Earth, brought down not by a single blow, but by the near simultaneous arrival of two of the most violent processes this planet is capable of producing. Whether the volcanism alone would eventually have finished what it started without the asteroid, whether the asteroid alone would have caused the same scale of collapse without a planet already destabilized by volcanic gas, and whether the impact itself reached across the globe and turned the Deccan eruptions into something even larger than they would otherwise have been, are questions the current evidence cannot yet answer with certainty. Different research groups, working with different modeling assumptions, different fossil data sets, and different dating techniques, continue to arrive at genuinely different weightings of the two mechanisms. From the PNA's ecological modeling team that found the Deccan traps could not reproduce the observed extinction on their own, to the Dartmouth computational study that found the opposite, that volcanism alone could plausibly have been sufficient. Both are peer-reviewed. Both are built on real data. Neither has been shown to be wrong. That, more than any single finding, is the honest state of this science in the mid-2020s, a field that has grown far more precise about when these two catastrophes happened without yet reaching agreement on exactly how much killing power to assign to each one. What the evidence does answer, decisively and with a precision that grows sharper every year, new dating techniques are applied to these rocks, is that the old story of a single asteroid ending the age of dinosaurs in one clean afternoon was never the whole truth. It was always, from the very beginning, the story of two disasters that happened to arrive at almost exactly the same time, one falling from space in a matter of seconds, the other rising from the Earth's own interior across 250,000 years, converging on the same 150-million-year-old world within a window so narrow that even today's most sophisticated radiometric clocks can barely tell the two apart. 45 years after the first iridium layer was pulled from a rock face in Italy, and more than a decade after the first zircon crystals from the Deccan traps were dated with enough precision to place the eruptions within 250,000 years of the boundary, scientists are still working out exactly how those two disasters found each other, still refining the timeline year by year, study by study, and still, in the most literal and current sense, writing the final chapter of the story of what actually killed the dinosaurs.